So I'm Mike Wheeler. I'm going to turn the reins over right now to Guhan Subramanian, who's heads the program of negotiation. Also is, to my knowledge, the only person in Harvard University history to be jointly tenured at the business school and the law school. He pays me a royalty every year because he was under my wing some years ago as a research teaching assistant, and he has far outstripped anything that I've accomplished. So I'm delighted that you're heading the program of negotiation, and if you can join us now, hop in, and then I'll come back on.
Great. Thanks, Mike, for the introduction. And you missed the most important part, Mike, which is that I was your student in 1995. In fact, the first negotiation course I ever took was in your class, and I sat in the front row and was very diligent as a student, and I think got a grade that reflected my hard work. So thank you for that. Mm-hmm. I want to welcome everybody here today. Thank you for being part of this exciting conference. For those of you who I don't know, my name is Guhan Subramanian. I'm the faculty chair, as Mike said, for the Harvard Law School Program of Negotiation. It is a great pleasure to welcome you all. For those who don't know PON that well, I'll just say very briefly that PON was founded in 1983 at Harvard Law School by Roger Fisher at HLS, Frank Sander at HLS, Howard Rafa from the business school, but also including Larry Susskind, who's here today. Mike Wheeler was there at the origins. I think Joel might have been there, not trying to reveal any ages here, but there's at least a few people on this webinar. And Jim was a young graduate student at the time, so lots of people who have been here for a long time as part of PON. As many of you know, the goal for PON, the objective, the mission is to improve the theory and practice of negotiation around the world. And I think both aspects of that are very important to our mission. The theory, the research is always important, and we have to be grounded in our research. But PON, and I think all of us here on this conference, have been very practical in our research, not just thinking about frameworks and tools and systems, but how do they work in the real world? And that's an important part of what PON has been involved in over the years as well. I've had the great pleasure to chair PON since 2018 when Bob Mnookin stepped down as the faculty chair. And one of the things that I've tried to emphasize, and I know Bob emphasized this as well, was conferences like this. Conferences where people could come together and discuss some of the research they've been doing, some of the latest developments in the field, and maybe most importantly for current purposes, where is the research, where is the field going forward from here. So Mike Wheeler proposed this to the executive committee back in the fall. And it was just a no-brainer. Of course, this topic is an incredibly important topic, and we were so thrilled to sponsor it as PON. Obviously, we were hoping for an in-person conference when we agreed to do it, but obviously that couldn't happen, and we're doing it this way. Having said that, I think the format is probably uniquely appropriate given the subject matter. So I look forward to following the discussion over the next couple of days. One just observation, personal observation. My own research is nowhere near this field, so I'll be more of a listener than a talker over the next couple of days. And I do consider myself, my children would confirm this, and I'm a bit of a Luddite with technology in general. But I have to say that there was a particular moment for me, which goes back to 2017, when Bob Mnookin and I were picking the winner of the Fisher-Sander Prize at Harvard Law School. And there were probably 30 submissions for that prize. Many of them were SJD dissertations, 70, 80 pages long. And there was a very short paper by Evan King, who I don't know this person. He's probably a preeminent scholar in the field, but I never met the guy in my life. But he was a Harvard Law School student, and he wrote a paper called Artificial Negotiators. And Bob and I both read the paper independently. It was probably 30 pages long. And both of us said, this is a really interesting paper. And for the first time for me, and for many of you, it was probably before that, I thought about artificial negotiations as being something more than just speculative, in the same way that self-driving cars seemed totally ridiculous 10 years ago, and now it's just a matter of when, not if. Likewise, that 2017 paper for me was a moment where I said, wow, this is really going to happen, and it's important for PON to be part of the conversation rather than just observing it. So that obviously brings us to our conference today. I'm thrilled to be kicking us off. I'm going to turn it back over to Mike in just a minute for the first session. But let me just observe one feature of the conference, which has been very important in the overall design. Mike has deliberately limited it to 50 people. I was kicking and screaming with that limit. As Mike's former student, he won. I had to defer to Mike in the end. And I take his point, which is this is not a sit back and take it all in kind of conference. This is a working conference, roll up your sleeves kind of conference. And so I do think that's an important part of the overall time that we're going to have, is that we deliberately kept it small so that everyone can express their own views and we can have a good discussion among us, as opposed to just having a bunch of presentations where you sit back and take it all in. So it's very much a roll up your sleeves workshop or working group, whatever you want to call it. And I really do commend Mike and Jim for that. Final thing I'll say before turning it over to Mike, I do want to express my personal gratitude to Mike and Jim for really running with this ball despite all the incredible, whatever you want to call it, developments in the world over the last few months. Mike and Jim were undeterred and have made this a great opportunity for all of us to learn from each other. As Mike already mentioned, I mentioned, Mike was my first negotiations professor. He introduced me to the field in 1995. I wrote my first academic article under Jim's supervision. So I will say that we are all in good hands with Mike and Jim leading us over the next couple of days. Thanks, Mike, for that, allowing me to kick things off, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, thank you, Guan, for your support, your friendship, and so forth. I must say, just a personal note, as you know, even senior faculty get periodic reviews at the Harvard Business School. And when my time came up some years ago, Kim Clark was the dean, and we sat down in a small group. He said, "Well, your case is a no-brainer." And I said, "Kim, you know, if you're being reviewed for your work and so forth, no-brainer is what you don't want to hear. You referred to this as a no-brainer as well. I think that you're referring to the ease of making the decision, but we have a lot of..."
That is correct. I meant it only in that way. Sorry to be unclear.
Good. Let me push you to some brief slides here. I'll take a few minutes to outline the genesis of the conference and what we hope to achieve. And let me thank you, Guan. I assume my slides are up. Is that correct?
Yes.
So the gerund there, the working conference. Working is, the real hope here is that this is an important milestone in the field, and that this will prompt, that was Joel who just spoke up, not only work that will appear relatively soon in the negotiation journal, but will forge new collaborations across disciplines and across contexts and fields. So I hope the work will be pleasant, but the whole idea of it, as you say, Guan, is to advance the field. So thank you, Guhan. Thank you, Susan Hackley, who runs the program on negotiation. Thank you in advance to Jim Sabinius, whom I will introduce in a moment, for stepping up and joining me here. This has been a great, great help, Jim. And then Laura St. Pietro has had the challenge of keeping me organized and has met it and then some on this, and she will be monitoring the whole episode here and tomorrow as well. And thanks to everybody who's come to present, the chairs and the panelists as well. I just went through the roster, and I'd mentioned this as some people were signing in. Half the people who are presenting I did not know, and most I didn't know of until we organized this. So it's great to have people who aren't just from Harvard, MIT, and Tufts, the consortium that is behind the negotiation, program of negotiation, but also people, I see somebody here is from Israel. We've crossed the ocean here to have Ron Kuttner aboard. So delighted to have such a widespread group. So we're doing a working conference, and that will get defined as we go. Today, after we have this brief welcome, Jim will join us in a moment, and Joel for the negotiation journal after that. We have one session today. Now, we had a particular schedule when we assumed that we would do sequential sessions, sequential panels, but we had to jam things up to make this happen on a schedule that wasn't going to be too exhausting. So we have concurrent sessions tomorrow, but today, appropriately, we have one on state of the art. And Ehsan Hoque from University of Rochester, computer scientist there, will kick that off in just a few minutes. And we're going to see examples, just the way Guhan raised his eyes when he saw the possibility of artificial negotiators. There'll be some things that we see that will be new technologies. They'll be introduced throughout the whole program, but we'll get a first peek at that thanks to Ehsan and his colleagues. Also, I want to give you a preview of what will happen tomorrow, and to remind you that although we'll close at 5:30 today, 5:30 here in the East, we'll keep the conversation going on a casual basis if people want to linger. And then at 6 o'clock, there's going to be a demonstration of a avatar app, if you will, that Chris Dede introduced me to several months ago. It's going to be demonstrated by company Immersion, by Carrie Straub, who will let us into a platform that is their platform. I had my students do this, a selection of my students this past spring. I hope she doesn't take offense. It's weird when you're negotiating with an avatar. It also, I'm convinced of its power as a instructional tool. I'll just say that, and I'll be involved in that conversation and happy to tell you what my students' experience of that was. But if you don't have that, you should have the link for that. If you don't, just please contact Laura and she will send it to you. Then tomorrow, we have, as I say, concurrent sessions. And that means that if you're diligent, you'll be going to 3 of those, but not 6. The good news is that these are all being recorded, and they'll be up relatively soon after we close. Relatively soon does not mean this week, incidentally, but before terribly long. So whatever you miss, you can jump into next week or the week beyond. I say that because as you decide which you want to go to, I think there are 2 perhaps contrary criteria that you might apply. One is stretch yourself. Look for something that's a long way from your experience, and I would give that priority. On the other hand, there's something to be said for stepping into a conversation to which you might be able to make some sort of contribution. We leave it to you, and frankly have no way of predicting how that's going to go. But obviously it's a broad spread of activities. Our hope all the while in this is to be provocative in the best way that word can be heard. Provocative in the sense of stimulating our thinking, promoting new collaborations that are across different fields, different disciplines, different contexts, as I said, and generative both in terms of research, case studies. I've developed some negotiations exercises that are computer-based, and I hope those will inspire other people to do similar kinds of work. So those are shorthand titles. You've got the links thanks to Laura's distribution. Just some rules of etiquette and so forth. This will be informal but focused. The panel chairs are going to do the introductions for their panels, introducing themselves and their fellow panelists. And they will moderate the back and forth among the 3 or 4 people who are on that panel. Others will sit in the wings. I'll be one of them for several of these. And I will monitor the chat that goes on. And when I see that there are certain recurring questions come up, I will jump into the conversation very briefly and let the moderator know that there's somebody who might be called on, or there's a theme that perhaps the other panelists can contribute to. Ask you, and I often forget, please mute yourself when you're not speaking so we don't pick up ambient noise. Also want to be a little bit tough love on this. We've got 90-minute sessions. We have several people speaking. If you do the math, that means that we're all working under a limited schedule. It can be embarrassing when somebody goes on in a way that compromises the time for other people. I won't name the person, but there's a person who was on here who told me just yesterday about going to a session where the speaker was supposed to have 10 minutes. At the 55-minute mark, my friend bailed out of the session. We're not going to get to 55 minutes, and sorry if I have to interrupt and say it's time to move on, but it'd be worse if I let some of the panelists who have worked hard to prepare, let them suffer as a consequence. So I would love to be spared that duty. And finally, as I've alluded to, recordings will be up relatively soon on the PON website. So watch your language. I think you'd be provocative without being provocative. And Lara stands by to help out in terms of anybody who's got tech problems on this. Lara, is there anything I should add here if you unmute? Anything just in terms of, no, you're shaking your head. Don't even have to do it in that. Thumbs up, excellent to that. So I'm eager to find out where we land late tomorrow here in the East, and that we can develop some kind of brief agenda in terms of what we can do next, and that the collaboration will continue. Jim, if you can hop in, and then when you're done, introduce Joel, that'd be great.
It's my great pleasure to welcome people to this conference. I am very much the junior partner in the Mike Wheeler enterprise, but lots of people are to be thanked for doing this. I was happy to co-sponsor it on behalf of the Harvard Negotiation Project, and Mike prodded me into an area that I had not thought much about, but was obviously something really worth thinking hard about in the social media negotiation. So, so you'll see the results of Mike's prodding there. I was happy to serve as a sounding board. I'm delighted to welcome people and thank all those who've made it possible. What I want to do now is turn it over to Joel Kutcher-Gershenfeld, the editor of the Negotiation Journal, because there's an important set of written consequences that should flow from our session.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Mike. And just in terms of dating myself, Guhan, I actually didn't show up till 1984 as a young graduate student. But at any rate, I have three thoughts to share with you. The first is that the Negotiation Journal is delighted to take the record that emerges from these sessions and provide a venue for it to have additional visibility and impact. Some of you are coming with work that is well underway, and if that ends up leading to an article for you to submit after the workshop, that is great. Both Mike and Jim have indicated that it's possible through the interactions that new synergies or combinations will emerge, and what you thought was a single authored article might become a co-authored or multi-authored piece, and that's okay too. There can be emergent work that comes out of this as well as what you came in mind. But the first thing is we're looking forward to the work that you're bringing, and we're open to it evolving. The second thought, Sylvia and myself are both here from the Journal. Sylvia is our managing editor. We'll be sitting in on all of the sessions, each of us taking one of them. And we'll be very anxious afterwards to hear from you about your intent. In fact, I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But we're also joined by Jean Brett, who has offered to be the guest editor for the special issue of the Journal, and we're delighted with her coming forward in that way. So that's sort of the team that you'll be dealing with your work. That's the second point. The third point is timing. What I'm going to ask is, within a week or two of the workshop, give Sylvia, myself, and Jean just a short note saying what you're intending to do. We understand that it can evolve and change, but it would be good for us to have an initial idea of what to expect. We'd initially set October as a target deadline for this special issue. In fact, because when we do workshops like this, the workshop itself counts as one review, but we do send pieces out for a second review as well. So I'd really like to ask pieces to come in by September 1st so that we can accomplish that. Sooner is better. But this is targeted for the winter issue of 2021. And so if you can work towards a September 1st deadline with a little flexibility if you need it, that would be great. So three things: you have flexibility, so there could be emergent work. You'll be working with Jean, myself, and Sylvia. And after the workshop, give us a quick note to say what your intents are, and then we'll take it from there. But let me just say, we are delighted with the prospect of a special issue of the journal on this topic. We know it's going to be widely read and utilized for theory and pedagogy, as well as perhaps policy.
Well, thank you, Joel. Thank you, Sylvia. And now we can get down to work. Ehsan, if I can turn the baton on to you, I'm eager to hear what you and your colleagues are going to tell us about the state of the art.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ehsan Hoque. I'm an assistant professor of computer science at the University of Rochester. I'm glad that all of you invited unusual computer scientists like myself, John Gratch or Sandy Pentland, to share ideas and project into the future. We hope to be provocative and futuristic. In terms of logistics, we have 3 speakers. They all will speak for 20 minutes. That's the instruction we have given. So if that goes well, if everybody sticks to the timeline, we should have around 9 minutes of Q&A. Hopefully we'll make that work. Our first speaker is Sandy Pentland. For many people, Sandy doesn't need an introduction. He's a professor of MIT Media Lab. He has done great work in computer vision to moving into reality mining, then worked on social imagery badges to look into dynamics within organizations, wrote a book on honest signals, look into society, and now he just wrote a new book on building the new economy. So Sandy, take it away.
Thank you. Well, glad to be here. As a bit of an outsider, as Ehsan said, you know, I come from a psychology and computer science background, work in several different schools at MIT and also Oxford, and am very interested in human interaction generally, not so specifically on negotiation, but I think maybe you'll find some of this useful. Let me put up some slides, which hopefully you can see. So I run a group called Connection Science. It's 32 researchers, 6 faculty. It cuts across the School of Engineering, the Media Lab, and the Business School. And there are some of the URLs. One of the things you might be interested in is we have a website and a report that's in the law area, of an alliance of law schools to think about the sort of computer-based law and what some of that all means. That's law.mit.edu if you're interested. We're sponsored by the little flags there down at the bottom. 7 nations at this point and a bunch of international guys. We're sort of interested in how do we make things more robust, efficient, fair, and safe. So those are the sorts of things that we do. The thing I want to talk about today is work that started some years ago when I was running a board of directors in India, and we were terrible despite having very terrible good people because it was just sort of seemed like there was too much charisma in the room. And that got me onto this track of how do we influence each other? And of course, you're all familiar with Kahneman and Tversky dual process theory. So your sort of system 2, which is the newer, phylogenetically newer system, sense making, it's conscious, it's slow, and it's very tightly allied with language. But the older system is also there. And in fact, it's responsible for a very large percentage of our behavior. And it's the automaticity sort of behavior. Kahneman estimated at 95% of all behavior. I don't know that that's it, but certainly a big chunk. It's very fast, it's very robust. Surprisingly, it's very good at complex problems that involve trade-offs. So your instinct, your gut, is actually often better, probably because of the time-limited nature of the problems you're confronted of, where it's not enough time to actually think it through. Unlike the sort of sense making in system 2, system 1 is not tightly allied with language. And you can ask, well, what does it use? What does most of our behavior use for social interaction? And the theory that I explored was that we're like virtually every other social animal in the world, using social signals. Certainly apes do that. It's a phylogenetically older system. And a lot of the patterns, surprisingly, when you look at it, a lot of the patterns you see, for instance, even in animals like bees, are found in humans. Sort of exploratory behavior, the role of excitement, and in fact, humans can read apes and even dogs in terms of their signaling behavior, which shows that there's some sort of basic ways of expression that are built very deeply into our physiology. At least that's the theory. So what I did in my research group is we built little tiny computers that people would wear that would objectively measure tone of voice, turn-taking, interruption patterns, body language, things like that. And we looked at wide ranges of behavior. And what we found, I like to break into 4 categories. There are other things you can look at also, but these are just ones that are fairly easy to relate to the physiology. The activity levels, are you excited or not? Fight or flight, that's your autonomic nervous system, the oldest part of your nervous system. Influence, you maybe have had the feeling sometimes that you're being pushed by somebody in a conversation. And that comes across in terms of signals as very different timing of how people talk to each other, the pauses between them, and so forth. Humans are unusual in having a lot of mirror neurons, although apes apparently have them too, which are parts of our brain that react to the motions of other people who are near us. So your facial area in your brain for controlling your face will react to somebody who's sitting across from you within arm's length. And the same neurons in many, many cases. Of course, it's not the same configurations. And it's thought that this is responsible for mimicry, sort of spreading activation theory. And then when you're very practiced at something, you become very consistent and very expert at doing it. So ballerinos, drivers, speaking. If you've done something in the area, like I'm right now, I've talked about this a whole bunch of times and I sound like I know what I'm doing, a signal. So it turns out that you can do role recognition, sort of traditional levels of social and task roles. This is Bates, I believe it is, roles. And it's protagonist, supporter, attacker, information giver, orienter. And this was actually done, same sort of system that we used on English speakers, on Italian farmers who were doing a type of task that is a sort of group negotiation task. It's called the survival task. You're crashed someplace, you have to decide as a group what to do, what to take with you. And we had psychologists annotate everything every 15 seconds in terms of the Bales roles. And what we found was just listening to gross patterns of the speech or gross movements of the head, you could classify the roles quite accurately. And interestingly, the video and the audio were redundant. It contained almost no new information relative to each other. And they were approximately as good as the human observer. So we could do as well as trained psychologists at classifying these things without having any semantics at all, which is pretty amazing. And we've seen this across language groups. We don't have any results for Chinese and tonal languages, but for several other sort of languages. It seems to be a very basic set of cues or signals that humans use. And we've used this in a variety of ways. There was an experiment with Jared Curran, who's I think in the readings that you got, predicting salaries from the pattern of interruption and laughter in the first 5 minutes. We went out to bars and looked at speed dating and found we could predict whether or not people revealed their contact information to each other with about 5 times chance without knowing anything about the people. And in pitching your business plans, we can do about as well as the humans. These are actual business plans and students that are about to graduate, mid-career people rated by other mid-career people. And so we can do about as well as the humans, but without knowing anything about the business plan, just by looking at the pattern of signaling. And in the case of pitching business plans, it has to do with the consistency, whether they sound like what they're talking about, and the level of enthusiasm, sort of the energy they put in. And those two things seem to say to our old parts of our brain, well, sounds like they know what they're talking about, and sounds like they really believe in it and are excited, so must be good. So it's that sort of a simple type of a channel of communication. A lot of the things I've talked about there are done with different people. I want to sort of give a few of them. Jared Curran, who's on the meeting today, David Lazar, who's over at NEU, used to be at Harvard, uses these sorts of things in political science applications. Some of my formal students are Ross Picard, who does effective computing, Bruno Lepre, faculty in Trento, does this out in the real world in natural situations. Tanzim Chowdhury at Cornell, typically in health, looking for depression, things like that. Ben Weber, student went off and founded Humanize, a company that looks at business processes. Anmol Madan started Ginger.io, which is a company on the West Coast that does mental health now for 500,000 people. It's sort of an instant coach, as it were. Josh Fish, Kajito Corporation here in town, does call centers for every major health and financial company in the United States. And actually an advisor to Mersion for the same type of reason, which I should mention. So I wanted to really sort of quickly say, well, so this is theory, you may or may not agree with it. Does it actually work? Experiments are one thing, actually getting it to work big time is another. So let's look at with this last example, Cogito, which basically listens to the pattern of communication between call center representative and a customer. So these are typically conflicts. People say, why don't you cover my health insurance for this condition? And they're confused and upset. It's a very stressful thing. Probably 50% of the conversations are fights. And what this does is listen to the pattern of communication and give real-time prompts to the call center representative. And this is a sort of a typical thing. Customers end up much more satisfied. What's really nice, though, is the employees end up better. So 63% increase in employee engagement. In fact, in a couple of cases, more than one, the call center employees have gotten together and written a song extolling the product. I don't think I've ever heard of that before, but it just helps them because they're not getting in fights as much. Okay, pretty good. This is a more recent one. What we've done is we've done a lot of online classes where we instrument them. So we're doing real time, not words again, but patterns of interruption from the voice, who responds to who, very sort of gross things within small groups of people talking. So for instance, one of the things we did is we looked at all the Sloan Fellows, which is it's 120 students from all over the world who come and do an intensive one-year program at MIT. They have to do everything in groups, and we instrumented all of the groups. And we discovered which ideas were going to be doing well. We looked at male, female, because the women complain that they never get enough airtime. It turned out that the women got just as much airtime as the men. but the interruption structure was a little different. Men interrupted women and women interrupted men the same way, but women almost never interrupted women and men interrupted men much more. And if you looked at the patterns of communication in terms of who follows who and how tight those transfers were, what you saw was an interesting thing. You saw that the men were, in some sense, holding the dominance. They're holding the floor and passing it to each other, which we think is probably why the women felt left out, is because while they spoke, they never really got to hold the floor and pass to other people that were supporting them. So that's an area of current research. I can show you papers on that if you're interested. One of the more interesting things we did, this is we ran a large course for the government of Canada, teaching people about AI tools. And the goal here was to get plumbers and builders and so forth to start using AI, which sounds really crazy. What we found is by using real-time feedback in the discussion process, so people would get little experiments about what to do, how to use data, what could they do in their businesses. And by mediating those, using AI, using these gross statistics about interruption and turn taking and so forth, we could get much better results than they typically had. So we actually found that 15% of the participants reported that they plan to start a new initiative in their current companies or startups, which is a spectacular increase over the baseline. So I think that's it. I'll just mention something that was mentioned already. There's a book on this, on the signals. It's online, it's cheap. You got it. And I'll just be quiet there. Thank you. Let's see, stop share.
Let's make sure to do a virtual clap for Sandy. There's a bottom of the bot.
Hey,
Okay.
Ehsan, can I just hop in for a second?
Go ahead.
I've had my students use the sociometer in my negotiation class, and we were able to look after the fact. It almost was like a histogram, and when you see, one person speaking a lot and somebody else less and so forth, and we could get into the dynamics after the fact. But what I'm hearing from Sandy now is that this can be done real time, so that people understand where things are going. My students found it very powerful. This was some years ago, and Ben was a big help to us in that course. But you can imagine using these in negotiations, obviously. I'll duck out again, but where I had first-hand experience in this, I just wanted to tell you that my students found it very effective.
And so now we can do this, we do this quite frequently online. So you get a couple people online, so there's no hardware anymore. It's just, it's a Zoom call, but, and now you can get a after-action report or even real-time feedback if you want. We find it very good for doing experiments because you can get a lot of people online. Anyway, thank you.
All right.
Are we allowed to interject or a Q&A at the end?
Go ahead, Jared. You're asking anyway, so go ahead.
Oh, okay, got it. I just wanted to tail on essentially what Mike was saying with real time. So Sandy may recall that we actually tried to give people real time feedback on the 4 dimensions while they were negotiating. And the biggest challenge we had was cognitive load. Essentially, we gave them real time perfect feedback on all 4 speech features, which were highly correlated with their performance. But their ability to change those speech features in real time was encumbered by how much effort one makes in negotiation itself. And we actually found that people really, they couldn't do it in that context. So I think what is needed perhaps is training to make people more effective at being able to do these things, as Sandy said, more in system 1, basically like the natural way of doing it, rather than trying so hard to speak in a different way than you would normally speak.
I mentioned 2 sort of spin-off companies that are doing this, and they spend an enormous amount of time getting feedback that wasn't distracting. As Jared said, that's the key thing. So in one case, what they did is they had very sort of actionable things like shut up, right? Just sort of, and the call center operators, after some practice, learn to sort of take this in without thinking about it. There's only a few of these things. And in the other case, it's just a little graphic that shows how dominant you're being, right? And you know, it doesn't require analysis or system two rather, sort of stuff. It's just, you know, you shouldn't be over in that part. Again, it's sort of ambient feedback. And this is in many ways the biggest challenge. Right?
Right. I think there's a lot of work done in computer science to figure out how to give feedback without overloading the user. And I'll add more on that when my turn comes. But that's a great question, Jared. But there's some update we can share with you. One other feedback, if you have questions, feel free to also type in the chat. That way we can also look out for it and summarize some of the questions and ask. Our second presenter is Jonathan Gratch, who is a research professor at Institute for Creative Technology at University of Southern California. John has done very pioneering work on building virtual humans that can do very interesting stuff online, including negotiation. So John will share some very interesting stuff on that. So John, take it away.
Thanks, Ehsan. And yeah, I'll also share some slides. So my background is computer science and psychology, and of course, computer scientists, we love PowerPoint. You can see the slides, I think. So I'm going to set up actually a little bit of contrast to what Sandy just laid out, because Sandy's done important work emphasizing that you can actually make some interesting inferences from these sort of shallow social signals without, as he mentioned and emphasized, without any appeal to semantics. And I want to emphasize that there's growing understanding that while that can be true, that semantics are incredibly important, and many of these signals and the relationships you see between these signals are context specific, and if you shift from one context to other, or even different actions within a scenario or a setting or negotiation, the relationships can change quite a bit. So let me just give kind of an example. And so we're increasingly seeing, you know, AI is playing roles in, say, screening your resume if you want to apply for a job, or now you can interview with an agent. So imagine you can negotiate your salary with an agent. And then we have Robot Einstein here to negotiate our salary with. And imagine he makes us an offer and he smiles. And so many of you may be kind of keying in on the morphology of that smile. Is it an authentic smile? Is that a creepy smile? But a lot of the interpretation of that smile depends on what just happened. So if he made me a really nice offer and smiles, that tells me, well, you know, maybe this is going to go well, or maybe he's soft, I can exploit him, I can get even more money out of him. Or on the other hand, if he made just a really nasty offer and he smiled, that communicates a very different set of information. Maybe he's a competitive person or just nasty. And of course, there's lots and lots of examples that the meaning of social signals are really dependent on the context and the semantics of the situation. So another quick example, Paul Ekman's face here, your interpretation of his expression depends quite a bit on the action that went around that expression. In fact, the actions around it may be more important than the expression themselves. And a lot of the work in AI and negotiation is really about semantics. It's about extracting the deep meaning from a situation. So, for example, inferring what a partner wants, what their goals are in a setting, and also understanding that that can be contingent, so that a person's goals or actions can depend on my own actions. And so understanding that more game theoretic relationship is often crucial in settings like negotiation. So really AI techniques emphasize the interactive nature of negotiations. And there's an explosion of interest in negotiation, I'd say over the last 10, 15 years, because it really is a challenge problem that raises all kinds of interesting issues from an AI perspective. One is a lot of work in AI is focused on collaborative interactions, teaming, but negotiation is a mixed motive situation. So there's mixtures of collaboration and competition. So from a dialogue system standpoint, these are non-collaborative dialogues, research on theory of mind. So there's a whole host of issues that make a negotiation an ideal topic for enhancing social intelligence of artificial algorithms. And a lot of this leads to practical applications. So for example, There's work in the UK and Southampton about how to create agents that can, for example, negotiate prices of power. So in this case, they're looking at a market where people are creating solar power, and you can have agents that negotiate with power companies or even other homeowners to set prices. And kind of the way to think of the way these negotiations work is everyone has an agent, and somehow you have to program or set your tell this agent your interests, your limits, and then they go off and they negotiate with each other and hopefully come up with efficient solutions. Now, my particular focus in this domain, Ehsan mentioned, I work on what are called virtual humans, and we're actually interested in not having agents negotiate with agents, but can we extend this paradigm to have agents negotiate directly with people? And so you may have seen kind of rudimentary example of this. Google has their demo of a Google Assistant where you can see this video where it goes off and can negotiate the price or the time of a haircut. And that's a very simple example. Let me give another example. This is some research in our lab where we're trying to build agents that can kind of do the standard case simulations you might use in the introductory part of a negotiation course. And so this is a multi-issue bargaining task. In this case, it's a scenario we call storage wars, where a person has to negotiate with an agent about how to divide up some antique items in an abandoned storage locker. And so in this case, they both really want these chairs, and you can see, and the person can interact with natural language with this agent. So here you see, this is an actual participant, and I'll play a little clip of what these kind of negotiations look like.
Well, I don't think we're going to come to an agreement.
It's pretty obvious that we both want the chairs.
It's pretty obvious, isn't it? But
yeah.
like I said, I'll give you one.
Well.
How about that?
That doesn't seem fair, though.
It doesn't? Well.
Not really.
I guess we can't come to no agreement then, can we?
Now, this is a simulation you can interact with, but there's also, because there's AI under the hood, there's a lot of analytics you can do. So for example, you can automatically transcribe what each party said in this negotiation. You can get this kind of nonverbal information that Sandy was talking about, so prosody, energy of speech, or facial expressions. But more importantly, I would argue, you can actually extract the semantics. And so you can try to map these utterance to the specific speech act. So this person's saying, I guess we can't come to no agreement. And so you can infer from that, this is basically raising the possibility of abandoning the negotiations, kind of a threat. And so you can automatically recognize speech acts like that. But further, then, if you have the semantics, you can then make inferences about the negotiation. So you can, for example, try to infer, were the offers that people were making efficient? Was a player being deceptive or not, given the information they're given in the case? And more subtle information, like, do they exhibit kind of certain cognitive biases? So are they showing susceptibility to anchoring, or do they come into the negotiation with a fixed pie bias, thinking this is a distributed negotiation? Or are they recognizing that the opponent might have these biases and trying to use techniques like anchoring to gain an advantage? Now, that system I showed before, that's very kind of bleeding edge, and anyone that's done work on dialogue systems, the state of the art, we're not going to have an agent that is very general that does that kind of negotiation with natural language anytime soon. So a lot of the work we do is on much simpler systems, which still allow people to engage in the same kind of cognitive processes, but avoid some of the complications. And so this is a system we've been developing called the Yago. It works online and allows people to negotiate, but rather through language, they use menus. So they can exchange offers with sliders, but then they can also do information exchange. So they can basically ask questions like, hey, do you like salary more than stock options, or make assertions about their preferences, as well as make a set of canned statements like threats or propose ideas about how to structure the negotiation. But the advantage of this technique is that they're AI under the hood. So these agents are negotiation agents that have core understanding of basic negotiation principles. So the agents have been given goals. They know how to use that information to try to understand their opponent, to try to make efficient offers. And a lot of the research is on how to refine these skills to simulate, to model accurately, or in some cases to exploit characteristics of human negotiators. And so one quick example that could be when you're negotiating, a key aspect is to learn about your opponent. Some of that information is explicit. So people say, I like plates. But some of that information is implicit. So through the exchange of offers or the facial expressions people show can reveal information implicitly about what the other person wants. And what you can see is that different groups have differences and to the extent they attend to information. Americans, for example, tend to focus more on the explicit information. Japanese negotiators often have a tendency to focus more on the implicit information. And you can actually try to build agents that have that same difference. And then that allows you to create a whole palette of different agents that act more like novices or experts or are more pro-social or more pro-self and so forth. Okay, so that's the kind of core technology we've been playing with. And I just want to touch briefly on 3 ways you can use this technology that I think will be of interest. First is really as a tool to enhance negotiation theory. And I'll briefly touch on how this can overcome some limitations I see in existing empirical paradigms for doing negotiation research. Another is as tools for teaching negotiation skills, and there'll be a talk by my student tomorrow showing how we're doing that. And then as actually potentially tools to negotiate on our behalf. And I'll highlight actually that that's some potential ethical issues that arises. So in terms of emotion or negotiation research, the thing that's interesting about these agents is in that they're really full-fledged interactive systems is they have certain advantages. So if you think of a negotiation, really the outcome arises from the interaction between the 2 parties. And so if you have player A wants chairs the most, player B wants plates, and they're involved in a negotiation, exchanging offers, player B might make an offer like this, which is good, it's ambitious, but from the perspective of player A, it doesn't reveal any information about what this player wants. Player A might respond with an offer like this, where he's actually exploring log rolling, making a trade-off. And this actually reveals information about the preferences that this player A wants. And so if he makes use of that information, player B attends to that, they can actually make more efficient offers by understanding the relationship between the 2 players' goals. And so this just emphasizes negotiation are fundamentally interactive, that the meaning of each offer is contingent on the actions of the opponent. That allows for value creation, but it can undermine experimental control because now you can't figure out what happened just looking at one party. And so what you see a lot of the research that is done in social psychology, at least on negotiation, tends to have a paradigm where people will interact with a computer program that follows a script. And the script is designed such that no matter what the player does, the script always acts out the same way. Maybe it shows anger all the time, or maybe it shows happiness, but it's not interactive, which is great for experimental control, but it breaks interactivity. And so from a methodological point of view, what we can show is that you can use these agents to, rather than having scripts, you can have different interaction mechanisms and explore, for example, give an agent a fixed pi bias and see how does that influence how outcomes unfold. And what we've been able to do with some of that work is go back on some research like by Van Cleef and show that some of these effects that, for example, anger induces concessions are actually very contextual, and depending on other aspects of how the negotiation unfolds, those effects may not be observed. Briefly, second point I want to make is that these are important tools for teaching negotiation. So traditional instruction uses some combination of lectures and simulations. And so what we've been exploring is lectures, but simulations with these agents. And as I mentioned, these agents are able to analyze the trace of what happened in the negotiation and make certain inferences. And that allows an agent to, in some sense, debug errors and how the student has understood negotiation principles and provide personalized feedback. And so my student Emmanuel will talk tomorrow of a collaboration we have with UCLA Medical School and Corinne Bendersky, where she's developing a video-based course of instruction where then people practice salary negotiations with these agents, and then these agents analyze the behavior of the students to see to what extent are they exhibiting knowledge of what they just learned, and then providing targeted feedback, either reinforcing when they've done well or pointing out things they could have done differently. The last thing I just want to mention briefly is that these agents are beginning to actually act on our behalf. And one of the big sort of questions is, how do we get these agents to know what we want? How do we get them to follow our goals and limits? But also, what are our values? And I want to raise this because there's been research, for example, by Bazerman that emphasized that if you act through an intermediary, you may actually, in a sense, be less ethical. You may have less regard for the other. And we were curious to see if people might have that same effect if they're interacting through their negotiation agents. And so what we did is we actually allowed people to program the ethics of their agents. We gave them essentially sliders where they could tell, is it okay for your agent to lie? Is it okay for your agent to engage in emotional manipulation? And what we found is actually people are very happy in negotiation contexts to have agents that lie on their behalf, which was a little bit disturbing. But it was smart in a sense, because what we've also done in our work is showed how agents can exploit biases. And we can actually show that a lying agent can be very effective in certain kinds of negotiation contexts. Indeed, every year at the major AI conference, they run competitions where people build agents to try to negotiate against people. And we were able to show our lying agent made the most money when negotiating against people. So there's an incentive to actually program your agents to behave in ethically questionable ways. And so just to wrap up, and in the future, we will be negotiating with agents, and those agents will have certain values, but really those values reflect the values of the people behind them. And the question is, how do we set up systems of constraints or principles to guide that to lead to more efficient, beneficial outcomes overall? So I'll wrap it up there. Thanks.
Let's make sure to do a virtual clap for John.
Ehsan, if I can just hop in for a second. One, I'm fascinated by what's going on. Two, there are a number of questions that are building up in the chat. There's no way we're going to be able to address all of them, but the whole purpose of this is to raise questions. And those of you who get into the conversation at a later point will have a short time to do that. Others, I hope, can linger a little bit and will pursue the talk. Third, I think you've set the bar pretty high for yourself in terms of your closing this out, but I'm sure you're up to it. So I'll sign off here. We've got another 32 minutes for your presentation and for a little bit of Q&A.
Right, well, yeah, so glad to see everybody being responsive and engaging in the Q&A, so keep that going in the text. I'm following it. Hopefully we'll be able to come back to some of these questions or even find a theme to address. All right, so I'm gonna do the final one, if I can find my slides. Yep, it's right here, and you guys can see my screen. Let me do that. So with my time today, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna talk about 3 different items. And I will talk about the problem that technology can solve. And then I will get into what are the early results we have, and I will project into some of the future directions we can head towards. The first thing I'll talk about the importance of doing studies in the wild, pushing out in the wild, and then be able to collect a huge amount of data so you can validate some of the existing theory or even come up with a new one. And I will give you some examples of the things we have done here. People have been studying micro expressions for many years now. I'll share some new outcome in applying deep learning on what we can do in terms of recognizing expression that human cannot yet do. And then I'll touch on AI being an impartial mediator. can AI be a mediator and be impartial, and what the possibility there? So I'll provide some ongoing work on this space and project into the future. All right, so doing studies in the wild. So in 2013, around 14 time, I had the good fortune of collaborating with Jared Curran, who's here now in the call. And we've been thinking, you know what, there's a lot of theories there. For example, poker face theory. It talks about you don't show anything, be neutral, and then do the negotiation to maximize your economic gain. And if you look at quite the opposite, which is rapport building theory, where you try to be a nice guy, establish rapport, show your emotion, be forthcoming about your preferences. So there's a lot of theory, and we're wondering, depending on the data set and the context you study, the outcome changes. So the question is there a way for us to collect significant amount of data so that we can go back and validate some of the theory? Because back then, such a standardized data didn't exist. So we did something that nobody else would do, and I think Jared might have been the only academic trained as a psychologist to be able to do this with us, because we said we're going to hire online workers to do negotiation. And as a task, we're going to give them the new recruit case, where one person plays the role of HR, and the other person plays the role of a job seeker. And the job seeker already has the job, and they're negotiating in terms of salary, their location, benefits, as well as what kind of room they're going to have, whether they're going to have window and whatnot. And each item has an economic benefit to it. And their objective is to play the game so that they have more points than the other. And if they do, they win the round. So this is what they do. Jared uses in his class to MBA students. And we figured, can we take this instructions and share it with online workers who have probably a different socioeconomic background, education background? Can they follow along and perform some of the negotiation? So back then, Zoom didn't exist, so we built our own video conferencing tool. We recruited online workers, told them that go email this person, have a conversation, and then see what happens. And if they are able to get more points, then their points, the payment is doubled. So I'm going to play a video of 2 online workers just meeting for the first time and playing along on the case of new recruit.
So thank you so much for coming today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, not a problem.
I'm really glad that you're interested in joining the organization. Just wanted to kind of talk to you and get your thoughts about, packages and what, would be beneficial for you.
Okay.
So that gives you an idea that people are able to get to that point and they're able to follow along. So using this model, we are able to collect a significant amount of data fairly quickly. And once you have the data, we can apply AI to look at their expressions, tone of voice, what they're saying and how they're saying it, to understand the nuances of the negotiation. So in the next slides, I'll show you another video clip of 2 people negotiating, but you will see how their smile, both of their smile are progressing through time.
My name is Chris. I'll be interviewing you today, and I have heard some really good things from the people that you have interviewed with, and I just want to go over details to make sure that we can reach the right position for both the company and for you.
So you get the idea. So given such rich data set, you can now look at the rapport, how they're interacting with each other, what's going on. So based on that, we built new models, looked into what's going on. We have a series of papers that we have published on this, but some of the early findings that we saw was that people who build a rapport in the beginning had lower value creation for themselves, but they're higher satisfaction. In other words, when they were listening to each other, having this rapport in the beginning, they were able to understand other person's perspective. When you truly understand other person's perspective, you can deviate from your point and start accommodating. So it was glad to see some of that happening in the data set we have collected. I'm going to move on to the next topic of micro expressions, and I'm going to start with a quiz, and I want to see some participation from you. So here I'm going to play 2 videos of the same person. In one case, the person is making stuff up, imagining. In the other case, the person is remembering. So you have to guess which one is which. Okay, I'm going to play this one.
It's probably really like airy and like fluffy looking, and you can't really see anything out the windows because of.
All right, that's one. Let me play the next one.
There were like our basement was refinished, so there was like couches in the rug down there, and then there was the main floor. So when you first walked in, the living room was on your right, and then there was like the kitchen and the dining room and the bathroom.
So going back to what Sandy said, nonverbal plays a huge role, but was it helpful here? Can anybody guess which one is imagining or remembering? How many of you think it's A who was imagining? Okay, I see some hand, okay. How many of you think it's B that's imagining? The opposite. I see some hand. Well, it's tough, but looking just at the video, it's very tough without the context to understand what's happening. And that's exactly what we see when you showed this data to participants. However, when you fed the data to a computer algorithm, it did close to 75%, superseding the performance of humans. And the question is why? Why did the algorithm do much better than humans? And what we did was we took some inspiration from a negotiation literature and tweaked the experiment a little bit. So I'll tell you exactly what we did. So there's a book, some of you might have read it. It mentions HPS in the first page of the book. Chris Voss, who is a former FBI, former hostess negotiator. So in his book, he talked about the importance of baselining. So let me play the clip to see what he says.
What I'm really looking for is the way a polygraph works is it's not trying to pick up your tells, it's trying to establish your baseline. What do you look like when you're telling the truth? You're going to lie 15 ways. You're going to tell the truth one way. So my small talk is really designed to get your baseline on what you look like when you're telling the truth. What you had for breakfast today? You know, what was your commute like in today? You know, how many kids have you got? The stuff that you'll tell, the stuff that the telegrapher asks you a bunch of baseline questions. And then anytime you deviate from that, if I say, look, what's really important to you? And you're like, does that mean breaking eye contact? Breaking eye contact, looking in a different direction. Chances are you probably got at least 4 different ways that you signal discomfort. Lying is just a means of discomfort.
So from that, we added just a baseline questioning in our experiment protocol. Before the interrogation in our case. So in the baseline question, before we even did the task, we asked them some questions like some question that would allow them to remember. For example, what do you have for breakfast? Or or maybe some arithmetic question where they have to do some math in their head. Or maybe asking question like, tell me something embarrassing about yourself causing discomfort. So there's a bunch of baseline questions we asked and collected a lot of data of individuals doing those. And then we had them do a round of interrogation. Similarly, we had another condition. We had people ask similar question, but here they would have to imagine. Like imagine you are in a kingdom in the bottom of the sea, describe what it looks like. And good thing about this approach is that we can collect a lot of this baseline data fairly quickly. And as a result, even though we may not have a lot of relevant phase from the baseline data, we can use the data to understand what's happening in the relevant phase. And that was the trick that worked in this case. So what does it mean in the context of negotiation? Sometimes you may not have a lot of data when negotiation happens. But if you know the individuals, if you have a lot of the data in other contexts, you could use the data to better understand what just happened in the negotiation. In some cases, better than humans. And that is exciting and scary. I think the future is ahead where it's possible for machine to understand about human affect better than humans. So I'm hoping the following session will have plenty of discussion about how can you use computer algorithm to further empower human beings to be better negotiator. I think it's an important topic for us to discuss. The final thing I'll talk about is AI being an impartial mediator. Mediation is very important in negotiation. a mediator is able to successfully articulate both parties' concerns as well as preferences in a neutral language, so that they can create shared understanding and avoid exploitation. Many would argue that humans could never be impartial mediator. In some cases, they're lawyers or some other individuals, and they have their own interest in mind, and they can never be impartial. And the question is there a sweet spot for AI to be an impartial mediator? So let me give an example here. So here we had an online negotiation with 4 individuals, and the task was lost at sea, where they're given the scenario as if they're on a ship and shipwreck is happening. They have 15 items and they can only pick 3. So they will have to select the 3. And after that, they're going to have a negotiation with each other, which are the 3 items they're going to select as a team. And if they can convince the team to select their own item, they get more money. So that was the context. So let me play the video.
Number 3, I got the food. I said the map. The constellation, the stellar one? Yeah. Yeah, I actually had that one just below that one, so. What about you guys?
I had the 2 caliber pistols, but in retrospect, I don't think you probably encountered too many, like.
Why would you need a gun? It might be those moon bears, you know.
That's true.
Be vicious. You realize the only thing you'll be using it on is either blowing up your own allies' oxygen tank or shooting them, right?
That's true.
Or you could.
All right, so without even understanding the entire context, can you point out 1 or 2 things about the negotiation? Something weird? Something unusual? One of them never spoke. So in any negotiation, often you want to have all stakeholders to speak at least equal term, to be able, so you can listen to each other, understands everyone's perspective. That's what creates shared understanding. When that's missing, that's when you sometimes don't make progress. So what we figured is that we don't want to influence the outcome of the negotiation, but can we build technology that instills some of those principles where people are taking turns, they're able to listening to each other, demonstrating positive feedback. So what we did was we built a video conferencing system where, as they do this, we can analyze all their expressions as well as what they're saying and how they're saying it, and be able to provide feedback. Now, at the first step, we didn't want to give them real-time feedback, as Jared pointed out, that when you give real-time feedback, it could add cognitive overload. So the first step, we thought, okay, all right, we'll have them do the negotiation, and we'll give them post-feedback and see what happens. So this is what we designed. So once they're done with the conversation, a chat window appears, and then you can have a conversation with a chatbot. This is what it would look like. I'm an assistant, I'm here, and they can walk you through of the negotiation about many different metrics. And the user is in full charge. They're clicking and then moving forward as they're walking through it, right? So people can do this, and once they're done, they do 1 more round of negotiation. So we have published a paper, but I'll show you as an example here. So in one case, you see that there are 4 individuals. This is their floor time. You can tell that one of them spoke really most of the time, more than half the time, right? So, and that's not good. So that feedback in the second session, in many of the cases, you're able to balance the conversation a lot more. And as a result, you're able to make progress in the negotiation. Now, going back to the question, all right, this is post-feedback, but how about real-time feedback? Because I want to get feedback on the moment to decide what I can do right now. So we played with that as well. And here, the context is this. There are 2 individuals who are registered as Republican and 2 individuals who are registered as Democrat. And they would come in and have a conversation around topics like gun control, gay marriage, immigration. And the idea is not to agree with each other at the end of the negotiation, but to be able to have a respectful dialogue, listen to each other, don't interrupt each other, don't shout at each other, right? So if you have all those qualities, hopefully you can make progress. So to allow for all those things to happen, we built an EY, and I'll show you a video here. of what that looks like.
Well, if anyone's going to have a gun, I would want to make sure that they're not a terrorist or.
So in terms of real-time feedback, as you can tell, there's a participation that's kind of static, that doesn't do real-time, but it moves slowly, so you know what's going on. The volume is instant, and here as well as emotion, positive versus negative.
I would want somebody who's responsible if they're going to buy a gun. And I think background checks are important to find that out.
Yeah, I agree with that too. Like, pretty much any like major purchase, you need a background check. And I guess that's not a major purchase, but like much deadlier than most other purchases. So.
And what we show is that by designing this kind of feedback, we allow people to be able to have shared dialogue, mutual understanding, and be able to understand each other's perspective, even though they don't agree with each other. And I think that's one way to be able to have shared understanding. So I would argue that the future is near, where devices like Alexa or Google Home or robots can be the mediator in the future. One good thing about that is they're impartial, they don't have any bias, and they're able to understand from all perspectives and mediate things as you need it. In fact, there's an article in earlier 2020 where colleagues from Northeastern are working on exactly this, funded by US Army. So I think in the near future, we may see this kind of possibilities of AI being the mediator. One final thing I want to touch on is microaggressions. And to stimulate that, I'm going to play a video.
But I don't know that that's necessarily going to solve the problem.
Of course it is. The National Guard is going to be there physically to stop the drug gangs from coming out of their houses with guns and shooting little children. They'll be there to stop it. And if they want to take on the National Guard, let them.
So you want it basically occupied?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Until these drug gangs can be dealt with by law enforcement. The federal government should be in there. This is so far out of control. They took over New Orleans.
I don't know why you're yelling at me.
I'm not yelling at you. I'm yelling at Jim.
So I trust Bill O'Reilly. I'm sure he had good intentions in mind, but sometimes when you get charged up, you become aggressive, you start yelling, and that doesn't help with the negotiation process. And often you don't understand that you're being the difficult person. And the question is there a way for technology to be able to understand when somebody's being difficult, intervene effectively, and give you some feedback as to what to do? Because we all have been in the situation where I know that I'm not speaking much, I got to speak up, but I don't know what to say. Or somebody's being difficult, I don't know how to mediate that. So I think there's a lot of literature exists in business school, especially in conflict resolution, where there's a rich body of literature exists that we can leverage to understand in this situation, what are the mediation strategies? For example, for placing disagreement, there are many ways you can do this, and there's a way to be able to give this feedback to an individual, like I might be wrong, and I often am, but here are the facts. Or I agree with your point, but I also think. Similarly, for turn-taking handover, which is an important element, there are many different ways we can give feedback right in real time to let them know how they can intervene in the conversation and be able to have a productive dialogue. So the final slide is, this is just a sketch I drew up with my student. Imagine in our Zoom, we can have many of these buttons and we can enable either participation, volume, emotion, or interruption, or disable them as you have a conversation. And as you need it, maybe a pop-up feedback can appear right here, as I see, telling me what to do. How do I get back in the conversation? How do I mediate this situation? And how that works. On that note, we still have 11 minutes left, so we have made progress. So I will yield my time back to the audience, and hopefully we can answer some questions.
Let me hop in first, if I may, and this is Mike Wheeler here. I want to thank the three of you for setting the bar high going forward. I want to see if, can you see my Monday schedule up on your screens now?
Yes.
Yes, good. So it's interesting, not just you, Ehsan, but all of you touched on everything that is yet to come. So we'll have some time to deal with questions, but you talked about mediation. There we are, an online dispute resolution. We have a political debate going on. Jim is going to talk about how the world has changed in view of social media and big policy and diplomatic negotiations. From our researchers on psychological processes, you've also talked about different modes of doing research that just didn't exist until quite recently. Everybody has demonstrated how this applies to learning and so forth, and we look at social impacts at the end and the marketplace. It's all there. So we're beginning a conversation. I know people have a lot of questions. As I look at the chat, I'm going to suggest, if you're comfortable doing this, Ehsan, if you can just, you've been looking at the chat too, I know. If you can take the reins here, and people can raise their hands just by going down to participants and throw a hand up. I'll jump in if I see something going on in the chat. I think if we can go till, because we started at 20 past to do the introduction, if we can go for another 25 minutes, let's say, to a quarter of or a little bit after that, take a break, and those of us who are going to go to the immersion demonstration can do that. So are you comfortable with moderating the discussion with people who've got their hands up for comments and questions, Ehsan?
Sure, I can do that. I think there's excellent questions, and I'm not sure that we can get to all of them given the time we have. So I think maybe we can prioritize, maybe start with some high-level questions that synthesizes three of whatever the ideas we all brought in. One question I have for the audience is that the future that we painted, is it scary? Is it exciting? Do you see that happening as a practitioner, as a researcher? What are your ideas and thoughts? And Sandy, you have a hand up?
Yeah, one of the reasons that we stayed away from the semantics, obviously semantics are very important, was that what we wanted to do was to look at sort of the frame for the discussion and try to get people to adopt a sort of basic frame, but not tell them what to do. Because the moment you begin doing that, it seemed to us that that was going to get complicated and there were ethical issues. On the other hand, if you tell people, you should nod your head every once in a while, or shut up and listen to other people, or don't interrupt as much, what you're doing is you're propagating a sort of universal pattern of polite interaction. So it's really like manners more than anything. And you see that developing internationally anyhow. It's one of the main things you go to school for. So we felt pretty good about that.
Anybody want to jump in?
So just
Go ahead, but just a quick note from Mike Wheeler. You can raise your hand by going to participants, and click on that, and you have a hand raised thing over on the left. I just heard one person's voice, and maybe after that you can call on Larry Susskind, Ehsan. But whoever took the floor there, please proceed with her.
So this is Kim, and just had a quick question around sort of experiments in the wild with what we've all had to do this last semester by teaching online, and it's also in this venue as well. We have information coming in on the chat. We have information that's coming in through visuals and through audio. And it seems like it's also a part of the how do you integrate the feedback or information that you're getting in real time, not just the fact of it, but how it's coming to you in what modality. And I love this idea around manners, because I think it does have to do with the intentionality that you appreciate the person who's giving you the feedback to have. Are they really trying to improve your feedback? Are they trying to direct you in one way or another? And I just wondered if there's more you might be able to say about that.
Sandy or John, want to take it?
I guess the one quick thing. Oh, also, for some reason I lost all the chat, so hopefully we're going to save all the chat comments. Zoom did some weird thing to me, but I want to just reinforce our experience has been Jared's experience, which is that people have a really hard time integrating feedback and working with our experts in teaching negotiation skills. We keep finding we're great at constructing all kinds of wonderful feedback we can give the student, and Corinne or I also work with Peter Kim here at USC. They say, no, give 1 point, and so the trying to pull all this information together, I think, is a real art. And I think it's great that the studies that Ehsan is doing is to try to, how do you account for that cognitive load in the most effective way? But I think the general lesson I've taken away is far less is more.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of a lot of the major work we did was trying to reduce cognitive load. So it's called ambient feedback, things that you don't really have to attend to. And a lot of that has to do with system 1 versus system 2 things also. It just as a sort of rule of thumb, you can't think about more than one thing at once consciously in your sort of linguistic mind. On the other hand, you react to things in parallel all the time when they're ambient and they don't rise to the level of sort of conscious attention. And so that's a mode for creating sort of I called it a trellis in the chat, a sort of framework in which you can do whatever you want, but it's a understood thing, like manners. And so as a consequence, we apply these techniques to, literally hundreds of thousands of random people every day. It works, right? But it's limited. We're not doing what you often think about in negotiation, which is strategy and things like that. We're just trying to make it a productive discussion where people feel listened to, where they feel polite, where they avoid arguments, basically.
I just want to add that we agree with the real-time feedback hurts. In fact, in one experiment, we showed that when they got the real-time feedback, they didn't perform very well. But in the next session, when they did not have the real-time feedback, the knowledge carried over. So they're able to understand, I got feedback, now I no longer have it, but they're able to carry it over and do a better job. So maybe there's
train people to do complicated things. And of course, that's why you teach negotiation.
Right. So you can actually, there's a possibility for training before the negotiation with the real-time feedback, and then go and do the real negotiation.
And the important thing is to demonstrate that actually does carry over, because many times you find what these tools do is you then offload your mental capacity to the tool and you do worse. So people that use GPS a lot, they have smaller spatial memory. And so there's trade-offs in both directions.
Ehsan, I don't know if Larry still wants to get in. Larry Susskind.
Thank you, presenters. I want to offer a slightly different angle in the hope that I could influence some of you and get you to take your direct work in a slightly different direction that would be most helpful. One of the ways in which I teach online is I have two people do a negotiation and record it. And then I have them watch an exemplary version of that same negotiation that two of my very capable students, after a lot of coaching, have done. Then I have them watch me debrief online in video the exemplary negotiation. And then I ask them to give each other, co-learners, each other feedback using a template. And that seems, from my standpoint and from what we've been able to evaluate, to help people become more self-conscious and more self-aware about their negotiation strategy. And so what I would love to have you think about is making a negotiation advisor who helps people learning debrief their negotiation more efficiently than they can do themselves. And I really do think that you're talking about collecting a lot of information. I know it's mostly about the dialogue. I'm more interested in their problem-solving success than I am in the dialogue. I don't care if someone only speaks once and the others speak 90% of the time. If what they say that one time produces a better result because of the intervention, that's really valuable to me. But however you structure the analysis, giving it to learners after they've done the negotiation, and then asking them to give each other feedback when they've both gotten that would be a very, very helpful supplemental teaching tool. One last point about the reference to mediation. A lot of times mediators spend their time mediating privately with the parties, caucusing privately with the parties, and moving back and forth between them. The emphasis of the mediator really isn't on the etiquette of the dialogue, although Susan Poziba's online and she might want to disagree with me on this, but I think our goal as a mediator is to help the parties solve their problem, get an agreement. And sometimes because emotion gets in their way, it's better for us to move back and forth between them. So the notion that a machine listening to people will tell them how to have a better dialogue, and that's a mediation goal, that the dialogue be better, undervalues the importance of solving the problem. And the mediator is not so much concerned about how much airtime each person has, or do they do this or control their behavior this way or that way. And so somehow, if you want to try to model what a mediator does, there I think you have to spend time getting the parties to map before they start their sense of the zone of possible agreement, their sense of trade-offs they would make, and so on, and help improve their analysis of what they're getting into, so that when they're in the negotiation, they're able to have a better negotiation. I don't think they need a screen showing them it's getting redder or bluer or more yellow because you're too angry or something like that. There are other ways in which you can supplement how people prepare, how people review, and what that does in terms of improving their personal theory of practice.
Sandy wants to respond.
Well, there's a couple of different situations. So one is you have people who are not professional negotiators, they're just trying to do something. And that's what you get in call centers, that's what you get in online courses. They have no education on this. They're completely naive. So teaching them about strategy and having things that are sophisticated rather above it, what you'd like to have is you'd like to just have a discussion as opposed to a screaming match where nobody understands. And so there is a sort of basic protocol that sometimes is violated, particularly in naive situations. Before I would think that the sorts of things, I'm not denying that what you just said is absolutely true, I agree. But I think there's a basic protocol, which is not screaming at each other irrationally, that you'd like to establish as a predicate for being able to do these sorts of things. And that's all we've tried to do. We're not trying to do anything really sophisticated, which requires really deep analysis of the scenarios.
And when I was thinking about mediation, I was thinking about our faculty meeting where chairs mediating.
Yeah, that's what got me motivated in that is that we had all the semantics around the table, but boy, were we terrible.
I think that what Larry is saying is that we're missing some basic text analysis that is needed in mediation to map the issues, to identify the interest, to maybe help reframe some of the sentences, to help people state things differently. Some of the basics of what we do in mediation that we still haven't seen how that is being done in the process with AI.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything Larry said. And this session has kind of emphasized nonverbal stuff, I think, but there's a lot of that within the AI world, a lot of the focus is really on understanding the issues and try to extract the issues and try to construct what a quote unquote a fair solution from both sides. What I would say is a lot of the limitation of those techniques is, well, first they use very simplistic notions of fairness. And also that they don't know how to reframe or come up with creative solutions, because typically they have sort of formalized ways for people to express their interests and values. And often people don't even know what their values and interests are until they get into the mediation. And so I think there's a lot of potential, but a lot of huge challenges into how to get people to represent and re-represent the problem as assisted by this kind of technology.
So here's a huge challenge for us, how to help people identify that, how to help them go beyond their basic positions, and that's a tough one.
Just a quick comment here. I'm switching back and forth on screens here to look for raised hands. People may not be familiar with the tool. If you click on participants at the end, you can raise your hand just by clicking on the hand. We'd like to include more people. My wife has observed that men are doing most of the talking here, and we have some deeply experienced and wise women at the table. Don't want to get involved in, calling on people who have not raised a hand, but looking for different voices here. And I'd go for maybe another 5 minutes, then we can take a break after we hear about the Merzen optional demo that'll start at 6. So I'm looking for hands here, at least to show that you're comfortable with the technology and you can hit the blue hand. I'm oscillating back and forth between 2 screens. And I think we can invite anybody to raise a hand at this point. And it may be that we've set the table very nicely for the sessions tomorrow.
And there are a lot of questions on the chat. I'm trying to read them all, and I wish I had, I could have this conversation as well as read and answer. I saved them all, so I will email some of you and follow up with all of you.
Good, and somebody had lost it. It might have been John. But these are all being saved, right, Lara? So we're in good shape on the chat. So
Mike, Jim, Sabine, Jim and Janet both have their hands up, just FYI.
Well, I think Janet is the one who gets called on then. It's funny, I didn't see her on that. Interesting.
Hello.
Hey, Janet.
Good afternoon, and thank you all very much. This is really fun, and I'm glad we're going to be together tomorrow. My question was to the panel around how to program the agent. I mean, what kind of machine learning would one set up to have that agent participate in the negotiation with either another agent or with a person? How do you think about the parameters for setting up the agent's learning?
Yeah, and I'll say from the AI side, and most of the research is agents negotiating with agents. And usually they make very strong assumptions about how to represent the task, which don't necessarily always hold in the way people approach it. So the standard paradigm is multi-issue bargaining task, often using something like Rubinstein alternating offers protocol. So agents have to take turns, and you throw away talk because talk is cheap. So really all they do is exchange offers. And then a lot of the work is, how could you infer that other party's interests? But then the interests are already predefined. These are the interests, here's your payoff table. Maybe it's nonlinear, but they often make very strong assumptions. And so then when you move towards trying to have agents to negotiate with people, you discover a lot of those assumptions are not valid, that people are not comfortable turning their interest into a number, that number changes over time, that discover that you can reformalize 2 issues, you can break an issue into 2 issues, And so that a lot of that gets back to really old research in AI about creativity, discovery, and there hasn't been, I would say, a lot of that work. I mean, you mentioned machine learning. The other approach is you just throw a lot of data at it and learn using deep learning algorithms, and they do something. Usually it's not terribly sensible, and then you rarely understand what the heck was being learned at the end, and so they're very problematic. So I would say the most effective systems are where you can really formalize the problem into a set of issues and some utility function, and then it's like this, the analog of decision theory. But then a lot of the interesting work is how do you get to that formalization?
Right.
And there was one other hand.
Yeah, Jim Sebanius.
Yeah, briefly, I found these presentations fascinating, and they stimulate a couple of possibilities both for teaching and for practice. I must say that I'm really struck by the cognitive load challenge in ongoing negotiations and ongoing simulations to take that on board. And I appreciate the efforts to find relatively simple cues that can guide people usefully. But as Larry said, if after the fact, you've had a series of measurements along the way of this sort of conversational intensity, whether it's volume, whether it's nonverbal expression, whether it's patterns of interruption, how much dominance there is, these kinds of things, if there were relatively standard and easy to use tools to monitor and record a negotiation, and then afterwards review it that way, often jointly, I think that while the first negotiation, might have had a lot of problems, if you were to do that several times, I think you'd probably, with some external training, improve your performance. And I know that you've shown that in some cases, but I have a feeling that could be demonstrated extensively. And if those sorts of tools were pretty widely available, I can see in teaching they'd be fantastic. Just for the quality and the productivity of the interaction. The second thing is in practice. Cognitive load is a real issue, and many times in practice, the way people deal with that is you don't have a single person negotiating. So you say, look, we'll bring a couple people in and sort of allocate roles, not so much good cop, bad cop, but one person is really doing the listening and the other is really, is maybe doing the speaking, and someone could easily be monitoring what's going on and pick up with the aid of some of these tools, wait a second, this is going off the rails in terms of the interaction, never mind what the substance is and so forth. And it strikes me that the ready availability of these tools, of which I don't really know, I'm aware of them in this experiment or that or these kinds of presentations, but they really have an enormous potential to aid and improve interaction.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think some of you might already use them. Like Jared, you use tools in your negotiation class and have them review stuff at Sloan, right?
Yeah, we do. And actually, this is something that Jim just said I want to comment on. Thanks, Ehsan. He said that, if we can just get this feedback in kind of a simple way afterwards, even in a breakout right after it's over, that would help give people feedback that's useful for them to improve their performance. The one area that I struggle with, though, is that it's often difficult for people to know whether the feedback is good news or bad news. For example, let's say we tell people you've been interrupting more than anyone else in the group. They might conclude, good, that's my theory of how I'm going to be a good negotiator. Or if they say, you've been talking more than anyone else in the group, they might similarly assume that that's a good thing. So what I worry is we do have a lot of data actually that we've collected, not just in my lab, but in many labs of the people who are in this meeting over the years. We have loads and loads of data on what people are doing. But until we have a really clear handle on what's good and what's not good, I think that sometimes providing people with so much feedback can be a little bit detrimental actually, because let's say I know what percentage of the time I'm smiling or what percent of the time I'm closing my eyes or raising my eyebrows. We have all that data, loads of it. But until you correlate it with objective or subjective value, I think it could be dangerous to give people that kind of feedback because they might assume it's good when it's bad or assume it's bad when it's good.
Yeah,
it
that's
also creates a lot of cognitive overload for them because they're going to start thinking about something that might not even be helpful for them to change. And even if they did change it, it wouldn't necessarily improve their performance.
That's where the correlation of some of these nonverbals and conversational patterns with subjective and objective outcomes, if you can say on average, that's really helpful, or most of the time that works against you, and there's some good data and some good analysis, then that enables feedback that's genuinely productive. I couldn't agree more.
I mean, one of those strategies people have tried. Sandy, go ahead.
Tool that does this. So it just gives objective feedback for people that are talking. You can decide if it's any good or not. I mean, if it's helpful or not. But like I said, was showing, sort of, it allows you to do a two-person video conference, and then it gives you an after-action report about interruption and things like that.
Right, I'm going to go to the next person, Janet. She has a hand raised for quite some time.
Okay, and then if I can hop in after that'd be great.
Janet.
Oh, I was already on. Thank you.
So Jared, when Leah Wing.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all three of you. It was very stimulating, as well as the discussion.
Oh, yes.
I guess one thing that really strikes me is that there's an underlying discussion about values that has, from my perspective, played out through each of the questions people have asked, as well as the presentations. And some of those are directly related to ethics, but also related to the purpose that we're using a tool. And so I just wanted to note that I saw that as a theme. And I was thinking about how, in my experience as a conflict intervener, I've seen a pattern, not to overgeneralize, but I've seen a pattern for folks who often can't get to the table. Once they get to the table, their very first goal is not only a particular outcome, it is to make the conflict that they've lived with be very visible to the other side. So escalating and sharing their emotions, for example, is key to conveying, since they finally got the microphone for the first time in the relationship or in the organization, etc. So I was thinking about, if our value is only driven by a particular outcome, then we might tell them to quiet down. And if our value is that their voice is heard, then we might give different feedback. So I'm just giving you one small example of how, and it kind of, from my perspective, speaks some to what Larry was saying about the idea that these tools might be used in different settings for different reasons, but it seems like the purpose will drive the way we design the tool. And so that's something I hope we'll continue to have further discussions about.